Welcome to this talk this morning about dementia awareness. My name's Julie Stanton. I'm a member of the church here at Walton. So welcome. So this talk is happening as part of the church leadership here, part of their review of all aspects of equality and diversity. So that's what made the subject come up. Was the leadership looking through areas of life in which we as a church family are being inclusive and wanting to review that with respect to dementia. So that's why this event is happening today, and it's really an introductory talk. It's not the right forum for making any decisions about whether we change anything. We just wanted to give a background talk to raise awareness really of the subject. I'm here giving it because in common with everything else I've done in my life, I think my main qualification is enthusiasm. So when Tony rang me last summer and said, "Do you know anyone who can give a talk on dementia?" I said, "I'll do it, Tony." So that's why I'm doing it, and I'm a retired GP. So although I'm not a specialist in dementia, I've dealt with it a lot. And I guess like most of us here, I've also had family members with dementia. So I've had a grandmother and an uncle with dementia, probably now a mum, although we're just not going there with the diagnosis. But it's going to touch all of our lives. It's such a common condition, and if it hasn't touched your life yet, it's going to in some way or another. So that's why I'm here. I guess you're here for similar reasons. It's a big issue, and it's going to affect us all in one way or another. So let's kick off. Feel free to ask me questions as we go. If you want to ask anything, put your hand up and I'll bring the roving mic because it is being voice recorded. And if we start running out of time and getting sidetracked, we'll stop doing the questions and I'll just stay at the end because I do want to finish at 11:30. I know people have got other things to do. So I wanted to start first of all by thinking about the difference between normal aging, something you may have heard of called mild cognitive impairment, and dementia. I wanted first of all to get those differences out of the way. Normal aging affects every system in the body, doesn't it? Nothing improves with age, except self-insight. That's the only thing I've found, which I've found to be the slowest burner for me. But everything else gets worse with age. Every other organ or system in the body. So our lungs don't breathe as well as they used to. Our hearts don't pump as effectively. We lose muscle mass, we lose muscle strength. And it's therefore not surprising that there are normal aging effects on the brain as well. And I suppose the analogy that came to me about that is cycling. If you imagine cycling, I've done a lot of cycling in my life. I wouldn't be able to do as much cycling now as I could 40 years ago, but as an experienced cyclist, I can read the road well. I can make very efficient use of the effort I'm putting into cycling because I can look at the terrain, change gear in advance, match my effort to the road conditions, the wind conditions. I can flog up a hill because I've still got quite good stamina, and I can sprint when I have to. But I couldn't just flog out the miles day after day like I could 40 years ago. That's a normal age-related change. Same thing happens with the brain. So it's normal to notice by the time we're in our 50s, 60s, that we're not quite sparking across the gap as well as we did in our at our peak. I still insist I'm in my prime, but I acknowledge that I'm past my peak. Okay, those two things are different, and I'm maintaining that difference for as long as I can. So we find it harder to learn new things as we get older. Our concentration is not as good as it used to be. But we can still, when we need to, we can sprint up the hill or churn out the miles maybe for one day, but not day after day. So that's a normal effect of aging. It's a loss of mental fitness, if you like, that's going on in parallel with our loss of physical fitness. So noticing that you're not as sharp as you used to be is not a sign that you're dementing. That's normal. Some people experience that as a kind of brain fog. It's variable. It can be worse if you're tired, worse if you're stressed, worse if you're on certain types of medication, but it's variable. It can be frustrating, but you can still do everything you need to do to look after yourself. So not needing any support, not needing any help with normal activities of daily living. So that's normal aging. You may have heard of the phrase mild cognitive impairment. That's a diagnosis. And if I just explain what those words mean. So mild means that you can still do most activities of daily living, but you might need some support with more unusual things. Things like doing your tax return, things like booking a holiday. But the normal day-to-day tasks are unimpaired. Cognitive, roughly that means thinking, but it applies to things like planning, following a series of steps, concentrating, making decisions, and impairment means not as good as someone as would be expected for the average person of your age and background. So that's mild cognitive impairment. It sits somewhere between normal aging and dementia. Unlike dementia, it can get better. So there are various causes for mild cognitive impairment, and they can improve. We've probably all experienced mild cognitive impairment. You'd experience that if you had a fever. You might experience it if you've had a head injury. You'd experience it if you were unwell for any other reason, and it would recover as that underlying reason recovered. So it can recover. It can just stay the same long term, or it can progress. It can be an early sign of dementia. And by definition, no one's got a crystal ball. No one knows which way that's going. But it can run a variable course, and it can be caused by numerous underlying health conditions, not necessarily a problem with the brain itself. So that's mild cognitive impairment. Dementia is itself a disease of the brain, and that's what we'll come on and look at now. If we could look at the brain of someone with dementia, it wouldn't look normal. So because dementia is a disease that affects brain cells, it actually causes damage to brain cells. And so if we could look at the brain, not particularly ethical to take out somebody's brain, but if we could do that, we could tell the difference between the brain of someone who had dementia and the brain of someone who didn't. And we could tell that just by looking at it with the naked eye. It would be smaller. It might be smaller in different areas of the brain, different parts of it. So it would be physically smaller. If we could look at it down a microscope, or by scanning, by MRI scanning, CT scanning, where you're making a virtual slice of the brain, again, it wouldn't look normal. Parts of the brain would be thinned. And if we could look at it in terms of the way it functions, if we could do certain types of scan that measure blood flow or nerve activity in the brain, it wouldn't be behaving, it wouldn't be working in the same way as the brain of someone who doesn't have dementia. So however we look at it, with the naked eye, down a microscope, on a scan, or on a functional scan, it doesn't look normal. So there is actually something wrong with the brain, and that distinguishes it from normal aging and mild cognitive impairment. Dementia, sadly, is always progressive, does gradually get worse over time. The rate at which it progresses is very variable and can be affected for better or for worse, which is something we'll come on to later on. So the way it progresses is not cast in stone. There are things that can be done to alter that. And as I'm sure we're all familiar with, it's a condition that affects people's memory, their ability to solve problems, make decisions, can affect their language, and it can affect their behavior. So we have a look at the symptoms of dementia in more detail. The main symptom, the most common symptom, the thing that people usually start to become concerned about in themselves or others, is memory, loss of memory, and in particular loss of recent memories. So initially somebody might forget a holiday they took 2 or 3 years ago, but remember that they'd been to that same place 10 years ago, been several times in the past, but not remember the most recent time. They might forget that they saw somebody last week, but remember that they saw them longer ago. They might forget whether they've had breakfast this morning or what they did have for breakfast. And they may, eventually start to forget who other people are, which is obviously enormously distressing for both parties. But it's primarily recent memory that gets lost. Confusion. So confusion is sort of needing help with daily tasks, things that we would normally not even think about, how to make yourself a cup of tea, how to get dressed. So difficulty with those normal activities of daily living that we need to do to look after ourselves. Confusion about time, so losing track of the time, not being sure what time of day it is. Most of us, if we had no access to looking at a clock, most of us would have a fairly accurate idea of whereabouts in the day we were. And most of us could probably say to within the nearest half hour or so what time it was. But that ability to recognize the time of day gets lost in dementia. The time of year, the month of the year itself, those sort of things they lose track of. Losing track of place as well. Forgetting how to get to places. And then maybe not recognizing where they are if they're in an unfamiliar place. So it's that disorientation in time and place, not recognizing who other people are. I don't mean people who you would know necessarily personally, but not recognizing somebody's role. If you're in a hospital and one of the nursing staff comes up to you, something like that, just not recognizing, not reading those cues of who somebody is. Difficulty in concentrating. So it becomes difficult to concentrate on any task for long. That obviously makes it very difficult to plan or to organize yourself. Difficult to follow sequential instructions, like a recipe. Difficult to keep track of a sequence of things you need to do. So you may be going out to do 3 things, but you can't keep those 3 things in your head. So a difficulty with sequencing or solving problems. Problems with language and communication in both directions. So that's problems with the receiving of communication and with the giving of communication. So it can become difficult to understand what's being said, difficult to keep track of a conversation, particularly if there are distractions, particularly if there's background noise, and particularly if someone is speaking rapidly and there's lots of information coming in, or more than one person talking to you. So it's difficult for a person with dementia to interpret what's being said to them. It's also difficult for them to express the giving out of communication. Difficult to find the right word, find the right phrase, or just somehow to express what you're wanting to say. So communication in both directions. Misunderstanding what's being seen. So finding it harder to judge distances, or changes in level, or changes in texture. Particularly difficult to judge the edges of things if those things are in front of a background colour that's the same as the object. So something like, and I only thought about this when I went for a wee about half an hour ago, our toilets here are the same colour as the wall behind them. Monica?
You're saying, Julie, that you lose depth perception.
Yes, that is what I'm saying. So you lose an ability to judge depth, distance, both of those things obviously making it hard to come downstairs. An impairment of the ability to interpret patterns or shadows or reflections. So all of those things become impaired. And that's why it's the visual environment of someone who's experiencing dementia is important. It's important that areas are well lit and even areas that are familiar to them. The stairs are a prime example, aren't they? Stairs may not be well lit. Edges may be of the same colour. There's changes in depth going on. There may be a change in texture going on if you step off a carpet onto a hard floor. So all of those things are problematic to someone with dementia. And then mood and personality changes as well. Normally our mood is fairly well regulated if we're in good mental health. Wouldn't vary really unless there was a reason for it to vary. In a person with dementia, mood is quite labile. It can swing rapidly and for no reason that is obvious to the person outside the head, not obvious to the observer. So a person with dementia can become sad, or angry or frightened or anxious for what seems like no particularly obvious reason. That's not exclusive to dementia. That's a characteristic of any illness that directly affects the brain. You may have seen that in people you know who've had strokes. It's quite common for the emotions to become labile. And that can be difficult both for the person with dementia and for the people supporting and caring for them and loving them. Personality changes, so losing interest in things that have always interested you before, becoming disinhibited in situations where normally you would have been more self-controlled. So those things are all to do with the damage to the brain cells that is going on in dementia. Sometimes those symptoms that we can see there combine in such a way as dementia progresses that someone can become completely confused about what is real and what is not real. So that's a combination of numerous of those symptoms there. Their confusion, their inability to concentrate, problems with communication, problems understanding what's being seen, excessive anxiety maybe, or irritability. They can actually lose those boundaries at times between what is real and what is imagined. So they might imagine they're seeing something that isn't actually there, hearing something that isn't actually there. They may experience delusions, so strongly believing something that actually isn't true. And that belief, the characteristic of a delusional belief, is that it's really not amenable to reason. Whatever you say, it's not going to change. Whatever evidence you produce, it's not going to change. So that's a distressing thing that can sometimes happen in dementia. So we'll move on now to think about the different types of dementia. There are different types. Not that that makes a great deal of difference for our purposes, but you will have heard of them, I'm sure, so I wanted to say something about them. There are lots of rare and wonderful causes of dementia, but there are these 4 fairly common types. The commonest being Alzheimer's. I didn't get round to looking him up, Herr Alzheimer, but I'm sure he's some sort of Germanic physician. Don't know, or he might have been a Bartsman. I'll look him up. So Alzheimer's is caused by abnormal protein that gets laid down in the brain, in certain parts of the brain, and it silts it up, stops those brain cells from working. And that typically causes problems with memory, so loss of recent memory, confusion, language. So that's caused by the body starting to make abnormal protein that gets deposited in the brain. Vascular dementia, that's the next commonest cause of dementia. That's caused by hardening of the small arteries that supply the brain. Now, we get hardening of the arteries all over our body. You'd be able to see that in all of us in the Western world from the age of about 8 or 10 years old. We're starting to get fatty deposits in our arteries, and the rate at which that progresses depends on a lot of things. But if it affects the small arteries in the brain, then that can over time lead to the development of dementia, because the brain cells that those arteries are supplying, not getting enough blood, they become damaged, they stop working properly. if a big blood vessel in the brain gets blocked or bleeds, causing quite a significant sector of damage to the brain beyond that artery, that's a stroke. So you tend to see that fairly suddenly and fairly obviously as a stroke. If it's the small arteries in the brain, then you don't notice a sort of sudden drooping of the face or sudden loss of function of an arm or leg or sudden loss of speech. You notice it as the development of a dementia. And typically with vascular dementia, it's the thing that's first noticed is an inability to problem solve or to make decisions. It's that kind of head work, that kind of cognition that's usually affected with vascular dementia. Lewy body dementia, that's another common type that is caused by the deposition of an abnormal protein in the brain. That's the type of dementia that Robin Williams had, which came on in his case fairly rapidly. And it causes difficulties in focusing, in staying focused and in concentrating. Which for an actor who had to learn lines and live off his wit and his talents was obviously devastating, and combined with not knowing what was going on. It wasn't diagnosed during his lifetime. So that causes problems with concentration and the ability to focus, and it can also cause delusions and difficulty sleeping. Frontotemporal dementia is less common, and that's a shrinkage of the frontal areas of the brain at the front and the temporal, which are the lower bits at the sides. And that would cause changes in personality, changes in behavior, problems with language. So those are the four main types of dementia. About 95% of dementia is covered by those types. And the commonest is Alzheimer's. I think that's responsible for just over 50%. I was listening to the radio the other week, and I heard Alzheimer's, it was an advert by the Alzheimer's Society, and it referred to dementia as being Britain's biggest killer, which is quite an emotive thing to say. And that made me think, I didn't think it was. So I looked it up, and what they mean by that is that the 11% of deaths in England and Wales have dementia on the death certificate, which may well be just an underlying cause rather than an underlying condition rather than the direct cause. Our biggest killers are still heart disease, stroke disease. But that doesn't make a good advert, does it? So yes, Britain's biggest killer. Moving on now to how common it is. About 900,000 people in the UK are presently living with dementia. It's quite a lot, isn't it? I think our population is about 65 million, something like that, isn't it? So it's quite a lot. I think it's slightly over 1% of the population. It's a disease of old age, so most of those people living with it will be over the age of 65. And it becomes commoner as age goes up. So it's becoming a commoner condition because our population is aging. The population in England, the life expectancy in England and Wales doubled over a period of not much more than 150 years. But in 1840, our life expectancy would have been round about 40, low 40s. In 1850, a woman's life expectancy was 51, so they weren't that bothered about the menopause in 1850. And by the late 1900s, 2000, life expectancy had gone up to the low 80s, around about 80. So almost doubled over the course of about 150 years because of improvements in nutrition, housing, hygiene. Nothing to do with the NHS, yeah? Or all to do with nutrition and hygiene and housing. So we are privileged to live at a time in history where we're bothered about diseases of old age. We're also privileged to live geographically in a place where we're bothered about diseases of old age. The biggest killers in the countries that have the 25% of countries with the lowest income per head of population, their biggest killers are birth trauma and infectious disease. So sepsis in neonates, so really not making it through infancy. Then pneumonia at any age, childhood, adolescence, adulthood. And diarrhea, those are their biggest killers. They're really not fussed about cancer and dementia. So let's keep this in perspective. We're only bothered about this because we're privileged geographically and historically. But nonetheless, it's a big deal. And because of our aging population, more and more people are living with dementia. So we can see the figures there on the slide. It affects 1 in 14 people over the age of 65 and 1 in 6 people over the age of 80. Which is quite a lot, isn't it? Now, so the total number of people with dementia is going up just because the total number of older people in our country is going up. But something that isn't widely understood and that's really important to understand is that actually our individual likelihood of getting dementia is coming down. In other words, and that's been the case for the last 20 years in the UK. So someone who is now in their 70s is less likely to get dementia than someone who was in their 70s 20 years ago. That's been a steady trend, despite the fact that I suspect it's being much more accurately diagnosed now than it was 20 years ago. It can be very difficult with statistics to know that when the numbers of people with a condition are going up, is that really because that condition is getting commoner, or is it because there's more awareness of it, so people are presenting more saying, is this what it is? Is it because there's a better test, so it's easier to diagnose, or is it because genuinely the condition is becoming commoner? Given that the likelihood of getting dementia is going down and has been steadily, consistently for 20 years, even though I suspect we're getting better at diagnosing it and people are becoming more aware of it, I think we can be very confident that it is genuinely going down. So as that trend continues, those figures are going to change. We'll find that only 1 person in 15 over the age of 65 has got it. Only 1 person in 7 over the age of 80. So I hope I've explained that well enough. I really want you to understand that, because I think the thing that we hear is that dementia is getting commoner. That's only because the total number of people in the risky age bracket has been getting bigger. Your and my individual likelihood of getting it is coming down. So something changed. my mum is 89, so she's been she's been over 70 for almost 20 years now. So she was right on that cusp of something changing that meant that she was less likely to get dementia than her parents. So something was going on. Born in 1934, something was better round about then than had been better for her parents. And we can probably all see that if we are aware of our family histories. My mum's upbringing was poor, as in they were poor, but not nearly as poor as her parents had been at that age. And that, as we'll come on to see, is a big deal when it comes to our likelihood of dementia. Who gets it? That's what we all want to know, isn't it? Who gets it? Most of the time, we don't understand why some people get dementia and other people don't. So mostly we just don't know. But it depends on a combination of these things, of age, of genetics, of lifestyle and environment, and other health conditions. But the most important risk factor is age, which we've already covered. Genetics, everyone's interested in genetics. But actually most dementia, the vast majority, and by the vast majority I'm talking in the high 90% of it, isn't genetic. So when a condition is common, if we let's take breast cancer for example. So 1 woman in 12 gets breast cancer. 1 woman in 12 doesn't die of it, but 1 woman in 12 gets it. So all women must have 1 mum and 2 grandmas, or they wouldn't be here. Most women also will have aunties, sisters, cousins. So if a woman has half a dozen relatives of that degree of closeness, mum, grandma, cousin, auntie, sister, and 1 woman in 12 gets breast cancer, then there's a 50% chance that you're going to have a relative with breast cancer. That's just statistics, that's normal distribution. It doesn't start looking like there's something genetic going on in the family until you've had 2 or 3 relatives with breast cancer, and particularly if they're getting it at a younger age, below the menopause particularly. So then you'd start thinking, oh, something going on in that family. But to have a relative who's had breast cancer, that's average. Likewise with dementia. To have someone in the family who's developed dementia in their 70s or 80s does not increase your risk of having dementia. If you have someone in your family who's developed dementia in their early 60s, it might do, particularly if there's more than 1 of those people. But with common conditions, to have a person in the family with it, that's just average. Yeah. So only about 1% of Alzheimer's is directly genetically inherited. The rest of it is multifactorial, and having 1 relative with it doesn't affect your risk. So that's good news. That's the other bit of good news I really want you to understand, apart from the fact the likelihood is coming down, is that the vast majority of it is not genetic. The next potentially good news is that there are things in our lifestyle or environment that we can do that affect either our likelihood of developing dementia or slow down the course if dementia is happening. So we'll come on and have a look at that now. This, I know you can't read that, and that's fine, because I'm going to put it up in higher magnification. But this graphic, the grey that you can see there, the grey river, is the river of life, which is flowing downhill, rather disappointingly, from the top of the slide down to the bottom. The green at the top, that's early life. Those are factors going on in early life. The blue are factors in midlife, and the purple is factors in later life. So this is showing how, as we go through life, there are different things that can affect our likelihood of developing dementia by the time we're flowing down the river and heading out into the estuary. And those things can accumulate. Obviously, they can accumulate and increase our likelihood overall. And amazingly, about 40% of our likelihood of getting dementia is to do with things that can potentially be changed, although most of us in the room are far too late to change them. But anyway, moving swiftly on. So I don't know whether you can see any of that, but this is looking at the first part of the river of life, early life. And 7% of our risk of dementia when we get older comes from what we can loosely describe as how much education we get in early life. Now, I'm not necessarily talking about school education at all. I'm talking about a lot of that, I suspect, is way preschool. So the amount of effort that's put into children, into giving children a good start in life. And that will depend on their nutrition, on their hygiene, on their housing, on how easy it is to present them to school or to any sort of learning opportunity in a fit state to learn. And that's probably what was improving for my mum in the 1930s compared with her parents in the early 1900s. Yeah. So I suspect that's what was the main thing that was changing, and that's what we're now seeing feeding through in those who are in their 70s and 80s. We're seeing that coming through. Just got a question from Catherine. Let me turn the mic on. There you go.
What age range do you count midlife?
Midlife, I always did count as being 5 years younger than me, but I've had to redefine it, Catherine. And for the purpose of this slide, they're saying midlife is 50 to 65. Yeah. So, there's another question coming up from David. Let me bring you the microphone. John.
It's a change of subject, really, not knowing how much longer we all have. As you say, you want to end promptly. Given the traditional and indeed, more biblical basis of seniority in a family, where traditionally the man takes responsibility for decisions, right? In our case, my wife and I, it's likely the way things are going, that situation will, of necessity, as you've been speaking about, be reversed. In other words, she anticipates a situation where she could be obliged to make decisions which normally would be deferred to the husband. Is that a situation with which you're familiar? Is there any advice of what to do in that kind of situation? Thank you.
Thank you, John. So, yes, I think dementia is commoner in women than it is in men, but you're quite right, it could obviously affect the decision-making within a family, couldn't it? Within a marriage, within a household. I think that really highlights, I don't have an answer to that, but I think what it really highlights is an important point, which is how vital it is that we all communicate with one another about what our wishes are, what our preferences are around the end of life, around finances, and how things should be sorted out, around future living arrangements. I think the best that you can do on a practical level is to be communicating about that sort of thing, the earlier the better, such that the person who's left with the best decision-making capacity knows that they're making decisions in the best interests of the person who can no longer make them. I think that's what would make sense to me and what I'd advise. So looking at midlife on the slide there in blue, there are numerous factors in midlife that can affect our likelihood of developing dementia. And the big surprise here, this is data that came out in 2020, the big surprise is hearing loss. And that makes, I actually can't read my own slide there, but I think is it an 8% difference? It's big, isn't it? I mean, that's stunning. What are you saying about my vision? Yeah? Okay, I could spin round. Oh, thanks. Thanks, Pippa. But I became disorientated in space then. But thank you. It's just been pointed out by the only person in the room who's young enough to benefit from this talk that I could turn round and see the slide there. Fantastic. So hearing loss makes an 8% difference. So get your flipping hearing tested. Yeah? And listen to the person who's been nagging you to do that for the last however many years. Because getting your hearing tested in midlife and doing something about it makes a big difference to your likelihood of getting dementia. And fascinatingly, even for someone who has dementia, getting their hearing sorted as best as it can be slows down the rate of progression of that dementia by 50%. I mean, I find that staggering. Such a simple thing, and you can slow down the rate of progression by 50%. So that's a huge takeaway message. Get your hearing tested. Traumatic brain injury is not generally something that somebody chooses. It's usually something that happens to them. But you can choose it, I guess, by doing certain types of activities or sports, which we're hearing a lot about now, aren't we? Boxing, football, lots of heading of those heavy old leather balls. So that traumatic brain injury can either be a sudden event, or it can be a repeated low-level thing that you don't realize has been damaging you until much later on. High blood pressure makes a difference. Unfortunately, treating high blood pressure with someone who's got dementia doesn't seem to make any difference. It seems that the die is cast by then. But lifestyle measures to prevent high blood pressure developing in the first place would certainly be good. Drinking within safe limits is going to reduce your likelihood of damaging those brain cells, and obesity plays a small part as well. So avoiding obesity would help. And then looking at later life, the big issue there is smoking, so it's never too late to stop, I guess is the message from that slide. It still makes a big difference to stop smoking in your late 60s, 70s. to your risk of getting dementia. Depression and social isolation. Depression's really common. Social isolation can be one of the big risk factors for dementia. So avoiding those things, treating those things, really important in later life in terms of either preventing or slowing the rate of progression of dementia. Keeping physically active, that can really improve someone's thinking and improve someone's confusion, is if they stay physically active as possible. Air pollution and diabetes, they're more minor factors. But if we add together all of those factors that are occurring from early life through midlife through later life, 40% of the causes of dementia are potentially modifiable, either by the individual or by things that we choose to do as a society. So that's the big take-home message for all of us, really. And in particular, get your hearing checked and do something about it. The question from Stephen.
I've been hoping you're going to say something about COVID, and I wonder if is it too early following the pandemic to say anything about COVID in its effects on the brain?
Thank you. Yes, it is too early, and it's too early to know whether COVID has a direct effect on the brain in terms of causing brain damage that results in a greater likelihood of dementia. But what is clear, and what you would expect really, is that the social isolation, the loss of familiarity, the loss of stimulation, the increased loneliness, the increased depression that resulted from lockdown will have caused more dementia to present earlier than it otherwise would have done, and will have accelerated the dementia of those who already had it. So yes, that is entirely predictable and disappointing and tragic. Yeah, it was a very high price to pay for a generation who I think were too respectful of authority and should have just said, this wasn't the spirit that won the war, I'm going to carry on anyway. It would have been a lot better. Yeah. And it wouldn't be a surprise if COVID turned out to have also had a direct effect on the brain, because it was a fascinating disease, the like of which we'd really never seen before, a multi-system inflammatory disease, which undoubtedly did some funny things to people's brains, without a doubt, for some people. So you would expect down the line that it'll become apparent that it's caused some direct damage that contributes to dementia, but it's too early to know that for sure. These population effects, can take a generation to become evident. So, can dementia be prevented? Well, we've really looked at that in those previous slides. Quite a lot of it, yes. Some of it, no. But let's not get too introspective and depressed about the no, because we are at a privileged time in human history and a privileged place geographically, and it is becoming less common for us as individuals, less likely. Can it be treated? I don't mean to be depressing, but I am trained in counselling, and the answer to that is no. It can't be treated. So there've been drug treatments around for dementia. I think donepezil probably first came out about 15 years ago now. But the evidence that the drug treatments for dementia actually make a meaningful difference in people's lives is really very poor. It's possible that they slow down the rate of progression, maybe, but whether they're producing benefits that are actually meaningful to the individual and meaningful to the people loving and supporting that individual is not clear. You can imagine the research interest, you can imagine the financial incentive. All research is driven by financial incentive in the UK, really, rather than being government funded. Imagine the profit motive for drug companies in finding the holy grail. The holy grail for any drug company is an effective treatment or prevention for a condition that is common, that affects people in the Western world. So osteoarthritis, dementia, they're really, really looking for treatments for those things. There are some promising immunotherapy type treatments coming along, but it'll be another 10 years or so before we know whether they're making any real difference. And the main differences have got to be, prevention is always more effective in the long run. The analogy really of the difference between conventional medicine, preventive medicine and public health is that if you imagine people falling off a cliff and damaging themselves in the ravine below, conventional medicine, our NHS, is patching up the broken at the bottom of the cliff. So we're doing our best to put people back together and to minimize the trauma. Preventive medicine would build a fence at the top of the cliff to make you less likely to fall off. Public health would say, why are they so close to the edge of the cliff? Let's build a town, let's build amenities, let's build transport links and infrastructure 20 miles inland. And that's where the big gains are with any health condition. The big gains don't come from looking at the individual and troubleshooting in a highly time-consuming and expensive way. They come from saying, get away from the edge of the cliff. And that's what that previous slide is showing us can be done. But sadly, I have nothing encouraging to say about treatment, and we're a long way away from anything that is really meaningful and useful. So, what's the experience like for dementia? Yes, the question coming in from over here. Thanks, Steve.
Would you have the view that it's best to try and have the person with dementia in their home environment as long as possible? Or is it better for them to go into a more institutional setup which claims to be able to look after the people better?
Thank you. That's a really difficult issue, isn't it? What I would say is, as far as you can, I'd make sure you're making the decision in the best interests of the person rather than the family. I think often when we make decisions for someone who's lost capacity to make those decisions for themselves, sometimes, if we're honest, we're treating ourselves. And if you look at what a person who's declining, who's becoming more frail for whatever reason, if you look at what they value most usually is autonomy, retaining their autonomy. their right to live in their own environment, their right to make their own decisions, their right to fall down their own stairs and hurt themselves, right to leave the gas on. What we as relatives value most is their safety. Those two things are different, aren't they? So I think this again is where it all comes down to trying to communicate about this sort of stuff in advance. It's so valuable. It will, if you take someone with dementia out of their own environment, they will decline more rapidly. They just will. Yeah? But they may feel, depends how they're feeling, so they may feel less anxious. They may accept a more rapid decline, so they may feel safer. But the likelihood is, I think, in my experience, most people in a state of advanced frailty of whatever reason who are removed from their environment end up feeling more befuddled, more confused, more that they've just lost their bearings. Yeah? But that's a decision that so many of us are going to have to face or are facing at the moment. And the short answer to that is I don't know. There comes a point where you have to choose their safety, really. That there may well come a point, but up until that point, I would try to ensure that I was respecting their autonomy rather than picking my own preference that they be safe. That can be very difficult within a family, because what you often find within a family, if we're thinking about the parent becoming frail and the children being the supporters, the carers, what you often find is that the children are not quite on the same page with that. Some of them value mum or dad's autonomy. Some of them really want to go for the safety. So, these end-of-life issues, what they always do is polarize family dynamics. You see that nakedly and painfully at the end of life. It's really polarizing. Stuff that's festered for decades all comes out on display, and the difference in people's priorities becomes really polarized. I would try to understand that maybe when we become frail, if we're blessed to live that long, maybe we will value our autonomy more than our safety. Maybe we won't be bothered about our safety particularly. So I'd try to respect that as long as I could, but with the caveat that I'm just going to come on to here. When we think about the experience of dementia, I wanted us to think about that from the perspective of both the carer and the individual who's experiencing the dementia. And I have deliberately and without apology put the carer there first, top of that list, because in my view, in any situation where somebody's needing long-term care, the most important person in that equation is the carer. It's not the person with the condition. I've always taken quite a hard line about that, because if the carer gives way, everybody loses. Everybody. The person who's needing care, the carer themselves, and all this, so the primary carer and all the other secondary carers lose out as well if the main carer gives way. So, in answer to your question, I try and value someone's autonomy, but when you're getting to the point where you're going to give way, do what you've got to do, because otherwise they're going to lose anyway. That would be my pragmatic GP approach. Another question from Malcolm.
I don't know whether you'll come on to this later, but are you going to provide us with information about how we can provide a caring, comfortable, welcoming atmosphere in church for people with dementia?
Yes.
And are how are we going to identify the people with dementia?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Yes, so we are going to move on to what we can do as a church. Oh, I've clicked. So in terms of the experience of dementia, caring for someone with dementia, as we've seen from the symptoms of dementia, if your loved one is experiencing confusion, poor memory, inability to take part in planning, difficulties in communicating, that's a uniquely difficult way to lose somebody, isn't it? To lose someone who's still physically there. It's a uniquely difficult way in which to be bereaved. We see the whole of human experience in healthcare. Anyone who works in healthcare, everybody gets sick, everybody dies, everybody hurts, everybody struggles at various points in life, and everybody experiences loss as well. Loss is a universal human experience. We're all going to lose that which is precious to us, be it our own health and life or the health and lives of those we love. We're all going to experience it. But there is a particular pain in experiencing the loss of someone who is still physically present. It's almost a mockery, isn't it? And as well as the strain of caring for them, there is the endless frustration of needing to repeat yourself, needing to answer the same questions over and over again. It is just endlessly frustrating and absolutely exhausting to care for somebody who has dementia. So we see, as a GP, I've seen the whole parade of humanity and the whole parade of human experience. I've seen some of the worst of human nature, but I've also seen the best. And the very best things I have ever seen in human nature are people's capacity to love and support one another in their suffering. That is a noble and a beautiful and a privileged thing to see. And it's been my privilege to see that many times and at close quarters. There is nothing more noble in human nature than our ability to care for those who are suffering. So let us do all we can to support the carers. The individual experience of dementia, we can only imagine how disorientating that is to lose your reference points and to know that that is happening. You will, I'm sure, be aware of the analogy of dementia as being like a bookcase full of books. Many of you will have heard of this analogy. If you imagine a reasonably tall, slim bookcase, an IKEA Billy, with books on, the different shelves, as it starts to shake and rock, the books that fall off first are the books on the top shelf. So they're the most recent memories. They're the ones most easily shaken. As you go down the shelves to the more longer-term memory further back, and then right down the shelves to the feelings, those things are much harder to shake. And I find it's really helpful if you're supporting someone with dementia to realize, to not worry about their memory. It's not their memories that matter. They will know how you make them feel. They might forget that you visited them that morning, but the feeling that you've left them with, doesn't go away. So it's trying to make that switch from communicating with somebody's head to communicating with their heart. And we'll come on to a few tips as to how we can do that. So we're moving from head level to heart level when we try to communicate. So how can we respond to people who have dementia? We as individuals and we as a church family. And I think, first of all, by thinking about where does somebody's dignity come from? If we think of someone who has dementia, where does their dignity come from? In a worldly sense, often only from what they have been. But for the believer, our dignity comes from the fact that we are made in the image of God and gloriously from what we're going to be. For us, it's not just about what we have been, it's about what we're going to be. And that's such an important thing to encourage both the carer and the person who's experiencing dementia. So when we're speaking to someone, most of this very obvious really. It's a friendly approach, giving and maintaining eye contact, trying to make sure there are no distractions, not being in a hurry. Talking slowly enough for people to process what you're saying, and that might involve repeating yourself. And talking clearly as well, using short sentences. And try to avoid questions. You know, that's our big thing, isn't it? When we approach someone and we're trying to get a conversation going, we always ask a question. Well, that's a rubbish thing to do with someone who's got dementia. You're going to increase their anxiety by doing that. Immediately, the state of arousal is going up, which makes them more anxious, which makes them less able to process what you're saying and to respond. So communicating, if you think of it like a game of tennis, rather than driving the ball at someone with a question that immediately requires a response, you just lob it up in the air, give them something, give them a lob, and so they can think about how to respond to that. Say something. Don't ask something, say something. That was a lovely service. I really enjoyed that last song. Don't ask anything, say something. Make it short, make it clear, make it simple, and then wait. Eye contact and wait. So what you're trying to enable there is an emotional connection. You may then get something back. Yes, that was a lovely song, wasn't it? And you've made an emotional connection there. Enjoy it. You don't try and pump it. Don't try, just enjoy it. Look for emotional connection and enjoy it rather than asking questions. If you need to ask a question, so at the end of the service, it's time for drinks, isn't it? Rather than saying, do you want tea or coffee? Just say, oh, I think it's time for tea. I wonder what I'll have. Will I have tea or coffee? I think I'll have a coffee. So try to use wondering, try to use indirect statements rather than questions. So you're giving someone the chance to think. I think it's time for tea. Looks like the drinks are out. Think I'm going to have a coffee. And then if you're not getting anything back, can I get you one? What would you like? But try and keep your questions for later rather than just firing out Do you want a tea or coffee? So try to give something rather than demand something. Don't argue on the way. So try not to get into an argument about what's real, what's not real. Try to just deflect. That's not always easy, particularly when you're living with somebody. And just be gentle and kind like you would with a member of your own family. It's not rocket science, is it really? How should we respond as a church? Well, I just want to touch on this today, really, because obviously I think the leadership do want to respond as a church, and that's what this talk is for, is to open up the subject, really. Give us a bit of background. But we are aware of the need to respond as a church. And there are lots of toolkits and good resources out there from churches about how we may do that. And the suggestion is that we look at that under these different headings that I've put up there. So looking at our pastoral care and how appropriate that is for those with dementia and those caring for them. Thinking about the church buildings, thinking about the sort of services and activities that we offer, and then about whether we need to strengthen any of our community networks. So with each of those, if we took something like the church buildings, we would want to think about how someone with dementia or their carers experienced our church buildings. And that would involve obviously asking those who have direct experience of that. So first of all, reflecting about it, then reviewing the actual buildings themselves. So we might think about the signage around our buildings. Do we putting a sign next to something for someone with dementia is very confusing. You should put a sign on it, ideally, rather than so like a toilet door. Is the sign on it rather than next to it? Thinking at, whether our lighting is appropriate, that sort of thing. So that would involve a review of the actual church building. It would then involve suggestions as to what could be done and decisions then about what was going to be done. So that thinking about how we'd respond as a church that's something really for the church leadership to take forwards. It's a subject I just really wanted to touch on today, but it would require a response in each of those areas and going through a process of listening to those who have experience and thinking about what we do and thinking about what we could do better. So, not appropriate for us to cover that today, but there is a lot to be done if we're interested in doing it, which I suspect we are. I wanted to leave you just with this quote attributed to Maya Angelou. People will forget what you said, people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And that's a primal thing, isn't it? That goes right back to infancy. In a baby, babies don't have to be very old, probably under 2 weeks old, before you can start to notice that they are more readily calmed by their primary carer than they are by anybody else. Yeah, they know how that person makes them feel. and something that goes that far back in our human experience is not going to be forgotten. Whatever happens to our brain, that's a primal thing. So that ability to recognize safety is a primal survival mechanism, and that's what the people who love us are. They are our place of safety. Yeah. So, yeah, my mind may not always know you, but in my heart you are always remembered. That's a quote from a book by Sebastian Faulks, who wrote a novel about dementia called Human Traces, I think. So my mind may not always know you, but in my heart you are always remembered. And it's important, I think, to take comfort from that as we try to support those living with dementia. So that's the end of my talk. Somebody's waving. Malcolm.
The last part of my question. Is it necessary to identify who has dementia beforehand?
What do you think?
Yeah, I think it would be useful to know.
Yeah.
But looking at your social interaction tips, I just feel that they ought to be applied to everybody.
Yes, absolutely.
And therefore there's no need to differentiate between those who have dementia and who don't. But I know some people in church do have dementia.
Yes.
And you find out down the grapevine, basically.
Yes.
Now, is that right, or does it need to be formal? It's difficult, I know, labelling people, but I don't know.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I take your point that there are advantages to acknowledging something openly, aren't there, for the individual? But there's also a downside, isn't there? And that applies to any diagnosis, really. The problem with a label is that sometimes the only thing that's seen is a label and not the person. So I think, as with any condition, some people would want to be upfront about it, others would not. And I think that needs to be respected, really. Yeah, so I think that's very much an individual thing. Some people would find it a relief to have it openly acknowledged. I'm sorry, I keep asking your name, but I have dementia. Some people would be that up front. Other people would regard that as a private thing. So I don't think that's for us as a church to make a decision about. I think we need to listen to the nearest and dearest, really, with respect to that. Yeah. Monica.
Hello, it's Monica speaking. I feel that as a church we have a great advantage because of the Holy Spirit, because we have the help of the Holy Spirit. He can give us perception and sensitivity.
Yes.
Because while it can be obvious that people that have got dementia, if people are just beginning to get into the effects of dementia, you cannot inquire about that sort of thing. But if you're sensitive and watchful, as we should be, he will reveal it to you.
Yes.
And help you to know how to behave.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you. It's great to have a helper. Tony.
Just like to say on behalf of the church and everybody who's here, a very big thank you, Julie, for your talk this morning. You've done a lot of work. You've been very clear.
That's just been part of my anti-dementia strategy, Tony. It's been like stirring a tin of treacle, but I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah, and also you've done a lot of exercise, bending down at your microphone. You've got your 10,000 steps.
Yeah.
Okay, but thank you very much. And perhaps we'll be able to have access to those slides on the church website.
Yeah,
I don't know,
problem.
But be very useful. And obviously, Julie's available if you've got any further questions to ask from now on.